Students arriving in September, we say really do welcome the students from schools and colleges and the office holders. You really are most welcome. Ideas are advanced through debate and argument, so don't hold back. Challenge the panelists and speakers. Or if you don't understand a point, just ask. Half the participants are probably thinking the same thing. So this is your summit too. Finally, I'd like to remind you that on Wednesday, the 23rd of June, next week, we hold the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction 11th Annual Conference themed around why warning matters and the launch of the UCL Warning Research Centre. The keynote speaker is Mami Musatori, the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and the head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, it's UNDRR. Further details are on the IRDR website. You're most welcome. Finally, I'd like to thank those who worked so hard to stage the Humanitarian Summit, and in particular, the summit organisers, Dr. Jessica Field, lecturer in Humanitarian Studies at the IRDR, and Dr. Virginie Masson, an IRDR researcher in the Centre for Gender and Disaster. Sarah Geel, the IRDR Comms and Events Manager, and technical support provided here by the MAPS faculty, by Peter Maron, and also the overall support of the IRDR Departmental Manager, Dr. Rosanna Smith. I'd now like to hand back to Jessica Field, who will chair the keynote talk on humanitarian action today, the importance of accountability and advocacy by Professor Dorothea Hilhorst. And finally, to welcome you all and remind you, this is your summit. Do get involved, do join in, do participate. I'm very pleased to see you all here. Bye for now.
Thank you so much, Peter. Excuse me. And I'm sorry to say that we didn't manage to stream to YouTube immediately. So some of that wonderful introduction was exclusive for the Zoom participants only, which makes it even more special. However, we should be up and live now on YouTube, and welcome to everyone watching from there. So for our keynote this morning, I'm really, really pleased to welcome Professor Dorothea Hilhorst. Thea Hilhorst is a professor of humanitarian studies in The Hague, and she's an expert in development in areas affected by disaster, conflict, or fragility, with a special focus on aid-society relations, including examining the impact of humanitarian aid on society and the ways in which people and institutions shape the organization of aid relations. Currently, Thea's main research program concerns where conflict meets disaster, and she studies disaster governance in high conflict, low conflict, and post-conflict settings. In addition to her academic research, Thea undertakes applied assignments and advisory work. She's president of the International Humanitarian Studies Association and a board member of the Core Humanitarian Standard Alliance. I think you'll be seeing links to some of these initiatives in the chat box over the course of the talk. As Peter said, the topic of Thea's talk today is humanitarian action today, the importance of accountability and advocacy. And in this talk, Thea will ask, what are the current trends in accountability and advocacy, and where are discussions heading? Importantly, what are the viewpoints of affected communities and civil society actors, and what is their influence on humanitarian governance? This builds on a new International Institute of Social Studies research program that Thea is leading on humanitarian governance. So I'll pass it over to you, Thea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I think you can hear me now. Eh? Can you give me a thumbs up?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much to Jessica, to Peter, to all of you for inviting me to this wonderful summit. And I have found it quite a challenge to prepare for my presentation, because there's just so much to say these days on humanitarianism, and so I'm already frustrated that I can't go deeper into any of the subjects I will touch on, but I will just give it a start, and we can talk afterwards as well. And I'm very curious. I will stay on for the panel afterwards. I'm really curious to see what you have to contribute. I love, by the way, this new webinar-based conferencing, and in particular, I love the chat function. So I'm really, while I speak, I will also look at the chats and see what is coming up in terms of questions, maybe even addressing them while I talk. First challenge here is I'm going to share my screen with you. Yes, And now I promise to do it in a way. I think this is the one. Share. Is this all right? Jessica, can you give me a thumbs up? Did I do it right? Yeah, I did.
Perfect.
That's wonderful. So now I have to go down to a gray area. Yeah, I am in the gray area. Good. So as Jessica mentioned, I've just started a new program on humanitarian governance, and I'm of course very excited to share some of the initial ideas and insights we have. And what I wanted to start is a very basic question, and I think it's key to what is going on at the moment, both in the humanitarian studies sector and in the humanitarian action sector, and that is, who is the humanitarian subject today? And there was some, I mean, if I would ask students as well, like, who's the humanitarian subject, it seems very straightforward. We are talking about people affected by disaster, we are talking about people affected by conflict, we are talking refugees, we're talking people who are in such a level of crisis, humanitarian crisis, that if we would withdraw humanitarian action, we would see an immediate upsurge in morbidity and mortality. I mean, that would be kind of our intuitive feeling, or who are the people eligible for humanitarian care, which is, of course, a special type of care. Humanitarian assistance is internationally organized. It is in many ways built on the idea of exceptionalism. So humanitarians come in exceptional conditions when people need a really extra little support, you might say. However, this whole idea of who's the humanitarian subject is completely undermined lately, and that is in many, many ways. So first, we see that many conflict-affected migrants, refugees, how you would like to call them, are no longer confined in refugee camps by their own choice. They prefer to live somewhere else. Enabled by technologies, we can provide care when people are not together and surveillance by humanitarian actors, but for example, living in a city and getting a little visa card. So that means that they live alongside and in a way that is hardly distinguishable from other people living in precarious conditions. So rather than having a clear distinction between refugees and non-refugees, we often see a continuum of suffering. It's a term of Cabot. And now in COVID, we see that it becomes very clear that COVID is really adding relief, I don't say relief here, but relief to the increasing inequalities we see in the world. And if you ask me, perhaps these increasing inequalities might be the primary concern and the underlying crisis that is going to define what the future of humanitarianism is, where we see quite I know there is a lot of controversy, and many people say that poverty is decreasing, but on the other hand, there's also lots of evidence that for larger numbers, large increasing numbers in the world of people are actually not just falling below poverty lines, but living in these precarious conditions that they don't know how to survive on the next day. And it would be very, if we take our intuitive idea of humanitarian action, if we would apply some everyday care, the morbidity and mortality numbers would really go down among these populations, I'm sure. So that's one. Secondly, there's this distinction between refugees and survival migrants, and we just don't know how to make the boundaries between them. And what we also see is in Europe and elsewhere, it's actually, there's now increasingly a creation of humanitarian crisis at borderlands because of policies around migration. So we wouldn't need to have a humanitarian crisis on European soil, except for European policies that work on the politics of exhaustion and just try to chase people out of Europe in every possible way. I just saw last night a documentary which is called Shadow Game, and which follows these young adolescents trying to enter the European Union and how they are being kicked out, kicked back, beaten up by the police time and time again, sometimes up to 30 attempts. not being in school, not leading a normal life, just trying to find some safety. It's a really terrible if you really look at that. I also like to recommend a special issue of the International Humanitarian Studies Association we've just done about this. And then, of course, which is the topic for you today, and which I won't speak much about, but I hope to lay a kind of groundwork on which to build that talk about climate and what it will do to humanitarianism. Climate-related migration and displacement, if you think about it, the estimates vary wildly. I find it also interesting within the humanitarian sector. I don't know exactly now, but 2 years ago when I was looking into this, for example, UNHCR would speak about climate refugees, whereas the ICRC will speak about climate-affected migration. So already in the terminology, there's a big difference. And the difference is about, are climate-related displaced people a humanitarian subject? Are they eligible to humanitarian care? And the complication here is, of course, that, and it's very important for you guys as well, because you're disaster oriented. There's still a tendency to see climate change as the crisis, as the disaster, whereas the golden law of disaster studies is that the hazard is not the disaster. The hazard is the hazard, but the disaster comes about when the hazard encounters vulnerabilities that are not mitigated by capabilities and policies to remedy those vulnerabilities. So one never is displaced because of the climate per se. One is displaced because one is vulnerable, because there are no policies in place, because one's agriculture still depends on rain. So that is what displaces people. And is this a humanitarian concern? Should humanitarians be in charge of taking care of climate-related displacements, and in what ways? It's a major puzzle, and I'm not going to solve the puzzle for you. I don't know. I'm just throwing up the question, and I think this is something that all of us will have to think about in the years to come. And probably you are already thinking about this. I bragged that I like looking at chats while I present, but to be honest, I cannot see the chat now. I only see my own PowerPoint and I see a few faces. So I will have to look at the questions later, not while I speak, unless Jessica interrupts me. That's fine. Eh? If you say, oh, there's a chat and I really want your attention, then go ahead. So what are some of the responses to this sort of extreme blurring of boundaries of who is eligible and who is not eligible, who is part of the concerned population of humanitarian action? Now, some responses, and I find it really terrible to see, is that you just bring the definitions back to fit doable proportions, and we see it happening everywhere in the world. So it's restriction on who is eligible for assistance. Once in the old days, you would be eligible for assistance if you were a refugee convention, remember. Now it is, no, you're not eligible for assistance because you're a refugee only when you're a vulnerable refugee. So there's an additional layer there. And for example, in Lesbos, where I did some of my research, it turns quickly out that first it was the case that vulnerable refugees in Lesbos were supposed to be shipped to the mainland of Greece and go into procedure. But a first scan of people in Moria camp showed that would mean that 90%, I think, of the people who are residing there should immediately be shipped to the mainland. So because that's not doable and not feasible, what was done is the restriction of the definition. So instead of saying the vulnerable go to the mainland, it became the extra vulnerable or the super vulnerable or the mega vulnerable. So it is all the time sort of bringing definitions to fit into what is doable, what the system can handle, rather than what people are entitled to or what they need. So needs are not just so important in that definition game. And of course, this is hugely facilitated by algorithms, and the technology of algorithms and the politics of it should really be a concern of studies in the years to come, even more than it is now. So the other response is promoting resilience and celebrate self-care. So we see a change of humanitarian action rather to give people, to help people help themselves. Very old discourse, but coming now, old discourse of development now entering humanitarianism. And I'd just like to remind you of the work, for example, of Suzanne Jaspers, who showed how in very detailed, how in Sudan, it's a bit similar to what I just mentioned about the vulnerable and the super vulnerable. Agencies would start to speak of resilience, and on the ground of the resilience of local populations, use that as a legitimation to reduce the package of aid by 50%. So we will reduce the food basket that we hand out with 50% because people are actually resilient and they can self-care for the other 50%. However, this was empty discourse. There was no evidence that people could self-care. There was no evidence that the area was safer. Actually, it was less safe. So basically, at the end of the day, people were just given half the rations they were entitled to. So that is really an issue of great concern. And my own work previously, and you may have come across some of the blogs I write about, is that young men, adolescents, they really fall into the cracks of the system very often because they rarely make it to the category of super vulnerable. In the Netherlands, after the fire in Moria, there was a huge advocacy to bring 500 children to the Netherlands, but they had to be below 12 years old. Because everybody beyond 12 or 14 years old was supposed to be self-caring. And well, the film I mentioned yesterday, one of the shocking aspects is the sort of flippant way almost that these young adolescents refer to, that they have to prostitute themselves to stay alive. So they are super vulnerable and really vulnerable, but somehow they are not in the eye of vulnerability, what it means. Now, there is also another response, and that is the nexus of development and humanitarian action and localization. So if you don't have enough capacities to care for all these blurring subjects who are actually in need of assistance, you can concentrate on the division of labor. And that is really happening in both of these, the nexus of development and humanitarian action. So why would it be the humanitarian actors? Why not development actors taking care? And why would it be us, the internationals? Why not the national actors? Now, why would it not be us that's already displaying the sort of continued international centered focus? But I will come back to that in the next sheet. Here, let me just talk about the nexus of development, security, migration, and humanitarianism. It's all getting very like a woolen ball and a plate of spaghetti that you can hardly unravel anymore. So I just did a research, and I'm happy to share with you on what you call protection in region. So it is protection, combining protection and humanitarian assistance, safeguarding of human rights, and implementing so-called durable solutions. Because there's too many people, too many migrants, we cannot deal with it. Durable solutions. Voluntary repatriation. Well, I'm not going into the voluntary. Resettlement and local integration. Resettlement would be that migrants or refugees are being brought to Europe or somewhere else, a third country where they are deemed safer or for responsibility sharing. And then local integration is rather than having refugees in a camp under a 24/7 care, try to help themselves and locally integrate through education and jobs. Now, interestingly, the policy pillars underpinning this come from different directions, and that's where we see the convergence. So it's both the comprehensive refugee response framework and the global compact on refugees and the global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. So, as I mentioned, this boundary issue between refugees and migration, there are two compacts, but they are very similar in their approaches and their responses. There's a World Humanitarian Summit that summarily brought out the importance of the nexus of development and humanitarianism that conveniently also comes up with the same responses and solutions that are embedded in the compact, similar to Grand Bargain. And we see a huge convergence. We compared 6 European countries, and they all have the same emphasis: education and jobs, rather than camps and direct protection. And what is very significant to humanitarian governance is we see now huge programs, multi-million programs, but they're led by development actors and not by humanitarian actors. Now, that doesn't matter, of course. I'm not peculiar about being a humanitarian actor or not. On the contrary, but it makes it all very muffled because we cannot quite follow the financial flows anymore. We have quite a discipline that humanitarian finances are being tracked through the OCHA financial tracking system. But with these programs in the region, we just don't know exactly where the money is going to. And importantly, my second point here, first, of course, protection in the region, but we all have heard and read about this commentary that is the political will and capability of host government, is it up to par? But the second point I want to bring to your attention here, and that is the budget allocations become very unclear because these programs have mixed objectives. They are there to protect people, provide humanitarian care, but they're also there to do border control and migration management. And they often combine these two objectives in one big program. And at the end, who knows? In our parliaments, who want to control those money flows and who understands at some point how much of that money that they allot to refugees in the region is actually going to the refugees, to their immediate benefit, and how much is going to border control and migration management under the heading of capacity building. Now, thirdly, local integration, of course, cannot replace resettlement rights and commitments, which we now see in many countries in Europe happening. A very uncanny convergence of where humanitarian action has become highly instrumentalized to provide local integration, whereas the resettlement right and commitments are not being upheld. There's very few countries that uphold on their written commitments on how many refugees they will bring to their own country, which is to the detriment of the goodwill of the host governments, who say, well, why would we continue to do this work if you don't stay with your side of the bargain? Very complicated issues. And I have a reference here to the paper I did, of course, with colleagues. It's not my own. I wanted to go back to localization briefly, and that is, again, a response because you divide the labor more effectively, you might say. But of course, it's a ridiculous term. And I don't need to say that, I guess, to anybody in this room. Firstly, if you have been studying humanitarian action for more than 3 days, you know that the humanitarian arena is much broader than those international agencies, and especially the international actors in the international agencies. There's very few expats anyhow, but care is being provided by especially local institutions, neighbors, local initiatives, civil society. Beyond that, civil society of its own country, government programs, and then perhaps somewhere internationals come in. So localization, starting from the international humanitarian machinery that is localizing as a gesture, it's not empirical, it's a discourse. So, but it's also, of course, a policy, a strategy. But then who and what is the local? I have a reference here to a very interesting paper of Samantha Mellis, who was my PhD candidate at the time, and Raymond Ebdorp, who you all know, I'm sure, that asks, like, who is this local? And is it in many cases, if you listen to the UN, they're actually referring to state authorities as the local. Whereas if I talk to international NGOs, they talk about national service provider, their partners, implementing partners at the local. And then, of course, some people will talk about the communities at the local. So which local are we talking about? And they're all involved and they all have a role to play in this networked, if you have an idea of networked governance, but it's not a network that it works together in that sense, but in this kind of arena where people are in dire need of assistance, will try to find and navigate to get some of their needs fulfilled, to go to get their children to school, to go to the doctor, to have a little shelter, to have some way to find some income, livelihood. So that whole humanitarian arena is very, it's not only very large, with many actors in it, but it's also very different and diverse, because it depends a lot on the context, how a humanitarian arena is formed and shaped. Now, a few issues about localization here, and I will come back to that later. Well, there's not so much later anymore, it's only 8 minutes of later. But that localization, we talk about it as if it's happening, if it's beautiful and it's wonderful. Of course, it's not wonderful because it's not really happening, but there's a strong discourse around it. But that discourse almost seems to negate that if we look around the world, if we take the work of Civicus, the level of authoritarianism in the world is really increasing very high. And in a majority of countries, we see increasing legislation that there's a shrinking space of civil society. So especially in cases where governments are perhaps the most strong adversary or part in the creation of humanitarian crisis, especially for minority groups. This means that the shrinking space of civil society means that the people one localizes to are in deep trouble often, and deeply marginalized, and etc. And of course, there is the anti-terrorist legislation that is being done by the EU, by the US, that also makes it very difficult, actually, for national service provider to provide services. If you cannot get money on your bank account, it's just a very complicated matter. So this brings me to my 2 points around accountability and advocacy. Starting with accountability. I talk here accountability to affected populations, and I'm very intrigued by accountability issues, and maybe some of you as well, and maybe more of you will be in the years to come, because I have a feeling that accountability is perhaps becoming a new key principle. It's first, it's a key issue when we need to deal with, we all see the scandals one after the other, one after the other. So it's a key issue in dealing with corruption in the sector, as well as sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And one scandal is undelved after the other, so we'll know how important that is. And accountability is common to all scenarios and types of agency. So if you take accountability, I mean, humanitarian actors, they still have this talk about the humanitarian principles that mainly apply, of course, in high intensity conflict situations, and much less so in post-conflict or in low intensity conflict situations. But also development agencies who may not have the humanitarian principles, but they work on aid harmonization or other types of ideas and principles, or human rights. All of those must have accountability to affected populations as one of their key organizing principles, and hence accountability might give us a lens by which we can study any type of interventions in the humanitarian arena as a kind of crossing concern. Again, the politics of technology are very important, and we know everybody understands that there's huge policies in the use of algorithms, but there's also huge politics, everyday politics, in the formats and consequence of accountability. What direction is accountability taken? Is it mutual? How does it work? Is it just box ticking? Is it exclusionary? Is accountability used to make some agencies, like high pedestal agencies, and other agencies as low agencies that don't deserve to be supported because they don't have the right boxes in place? So there's lots of politics of these technologies surrounding accountability that I think we need to look into. I'm also very intrigued by the fact that accountability is happening in formal and informal ways. as well as invited and uninvited spaces. So accountability to affected populations, what you see happening a lot is these things like a complaint box, but who is using a complaint box? Whereas what people do is they talk to humanitarians they encounter, people who come to their area. That's one way of doing accountability. And the other way is voting with their feet, just running away from certain programs that they feel are not helpful. So I think that a key to accountability to affected populations is oddly not just to listen to affected populations, but listen to those people that work with the affected populations and that have no voice in the humanitarian sector, the implementing folks that hear the stories and know what is wrong, but have no power to change because there's no flexibility in program implementation. So they can hear all the complaints, but they still have to go back to their log frame. So this combination of giving more listening power to the humanitarians and enabling flexibility, I think is going to be key. And in that sense, I'm also a little bit worried about these whole issues of how we deal. I mean, I don't say it's not an issue, corruption and SEA, but how we deal with it. If it's very top down, I'm afraid it will just strengthen the kind of huge closing off of decision power from the implementing humanitarians that to my mind would be the most important people to listen to if we want to change humanitarian action. Then finally, I would like to say a few words about the importance of advocacy. I started my talk talking about the widening or the blurring of who is the subject of humanitarian action. And this response to just restrict then the definition of who can be eligible for care and divide the labor in ways that are very insecure in terms of their outcome for those people who need care. We hand over to areas where there's a massive shrinking of space for civil society and governments that only steer whatever care there is available to particular areas and particular groups. So very often, what is done under the heading of resilience or localization, one may very legitimately ask, is it resilience or is it abandonment? Is it politics of abandonment? Is it like, okay, wow, wonderful, they can do it locally and people are so resilient, we can step out. So the importance of advocacy, I cannot underline more. And I have not much to say about it. We're at the beginning of our research program, but I'm sometimes shocked about the little, and believe me, I did scan the literature when I was doing my proposal, but there's very little written yet about advocacy outside very classical forms of advocacy like humanitarian diplomacy. So I really, we have a program around it, but I think much more should be done about this. And I hope that our program can also help to bring forward the discussion on advocacy. So there's, of course, advocacy by affected populations. I just, you saw the cartoon. It's people just shouting out. It's people working with their feet. It's these young boys that I saw yesterday in shadow games that just don't believe that there is good options for care in the countries that they have come through on their way from Afghanistan or Iraq or Sudan to Europe. But they do feel like if we do manage to get to Europe, that's where we get proper education. So, and we don't get it. So people will keep doing. It's a form of advocacy almost, that you just keep going. And there's the advocacy on behalf of affected populations. I also have a much broader definition of advocacy than some people. But some people really think advocacy is about influencing policy. So it's about having your advocacy officer in your office, and that advocacy officer makes the annual advocacy plan. And the annual advocacy plan is about going to offices of policy people, first to get more money for your agency, and secondly to do something on behalf of the people you work for. But advocacy is gaining influence. It's shaping, co-shaping what is going on in humanitarian action, and can have many forms. Again, formal, informal. There are many forms that advocacy could and can work, and we just have to open our eyes and see it. So advocacy has to be moved on the ground. And one of the things is, why not make the embeddedness of aid more of an asset by being more open to ally with those civil society actors that are very good at advocacy and speaking with and on behalf of affected populations. I am talking the feminist organizations. We're talking about feminist notions of care, but they're also just feminists to work with. People, women's organizations to work with on the ground who have already absorbed those ideas of care and actually work with it, advocate about it. And finally, this protection of humanitarian space. Sorry, I'm now rushing a little bit because I have an eye on the time. But I like this point to be brought out. Can I take 3 more minutes, Jessica? Thanks. When we did research in the EU in the migration hotspots, one of our main findings was that you all have an idea about how care works in those hotspots, like in Lesbos, in Calais, in Lampedusa. It is a mix of a few official humanitarian agencies. UNHCR would be there, some church related or whichever, and a sort of grouping of informal humanitarian actors, the volunteers, the solidarians, they call it in Greece. So we've been looking into the relations between them. And one of the things that come out, and that is just Europe, is that those volunteers, those solidarians, they feel really abandoned by the established humanitarian agencies because they don't protect humanitarian space. And now I mean humanitarian space in the classic sense, the space that is required for people to care. And what we see in Europe is a criminalization of that space. And I know that at the European level, and I'm not talking bad about the humanitarian aids, because I know at the European level they do their lobbying about this. But at the local level, those solidarians and volunteers invariably feel abandoned by the humanitarian establishment that doesn't speak out when the police comes after them, when they're being arrested, when they're being fined, when a car drives into them or into their care, etc., etc. This is Europe, but I think it accounts for the whole world. If the humanitarian international actors have a strategy to localize, it means that national actors take care, implement care, and hence should be protected to deliver that care. So I think the international humanitarian actors should really rethink on what advocacy means as part of the localization agenda, that they may have to step up in cases where the rights or spaces of those local actors are being breached. And it happens, I'm telling you, if you read Civicus in the most countries. Now, implications for humanitarian studies, very briefly, but it makes a lot of sense to everybody that humanitarian studies has been following humanitarian action. So we haven't localized much humanitarian studies ourselves. I think there's much more room for participatory approaches in red zones, you might call it. And I find it very interesting that development studies celebrates participatory approaches in so-called safe areas where there are many problems with participatory approaches. And then they say it's not possible in red zones because of those problems, whereas it would be possible. I'm happy to go into this in the speech later, but I just want to flash these numbers. More collaborative approaches. I think, I know that humanitarian action is, humanitarian studies finds it more difficult than more general development studies to have lasting research collaborations with institutes in crisis affected areas. So this is also a topic that we have in the International Humanitarian Studies Association. I'm now turning to the commercial block. So we have webinars in the second half of the year in Colombia, in DRC, in Ethiopia, about what it is like to collaborate from a southern perspective, from a crisis affected area perspective. And in our conference, 3 to 5 November in Paris, there will be a roundtable to talk about these collaborative approaches. And my own program, Humanitarian Governance, we intend to have monthly webinars. So if you want to be part of our club, throw in your email address, send me an email. But also if you want to speak on one of our monthly webinars, if you want to share about your research, you're most welcome to write me an email, and we'll see if we can fit you into the schedule. So this is it, Jessica. Now the big thing is, stop share is easy. It's up there. I will stop share now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Thea. And I'll give you the round of applause that Zoom doesn't allow you to hear. That was really, really wonderful, really insightful, and I think really set the agenda for the rest of discussions this morning and for the day. And I think some of the themes that you mentioned, like the shrinking space of civil society and the politics of abandonment, I've no doubt we'll go into detail in the next panel discussion. But for now, we've got about 25 minutes for Q&A. And we've had a number in the Q&A function already, so please do add more as we go along. I have a couple myself as well, but I'll go straight to the audience first. So we had a question from Patricia at IRDR saying, thank you very much for your presentation, firstly. And when you explained this focus on vulnerability, how do you see humanitarian actors have engaged with the idea of deservingness, also connected with vulnerability? So if you like, I can
give you
a couple, or you can answer.
No, if it's okay, I just go into this one.
Great.
I'm afraid, I'm very much afraid it has happened, and that some of these ideas of deserving and non-deserving have crept into the increasingly restricted definitions of vulnerability. And of course, in particular, and there's been a lot of discussion around this in Greece, that primary selection seems to be based on nationality. And that is, of course, a prime example of how the deserved and non-deserved issue has crept into humanitarianism, because if you are from Morocco, there's no chance that you would be considered to be shipped to the mainland for asylum procedures. Whereas the original refugee convention said that personal persecution is a main reason to be a refugee. And there is personal persecution in Morocco. There are people who know that they're on a list and they will rot in jail if they don't get out of there. So it might be true that for the majority of people from Morocco, they don't have a story that would entitle them to asylum. There are. So it starts with this discrimination on the basis of nationality. And I must say it's also very difficult, and humanitarian actors are under great pressure, of course. I followed a bit what happened in Lebanon. My remarks are always time bound. I talk about what I saw 4 years ago. It might have changed, but then UNHCR was really getting very close to the Lebanese government, and when the Lebanese government said it's enough, they wouldn't register new arrivals anymore. So that is going directly against mandate. So humanitarian actors often don't have a choice but to follow and align. And of course, by the end of the day, they also depend on what the parliaments in Europe and the European Union, what they decide about the refugees and how to deal with them. So it's a political issue as well. Yeah.
Goes back to what you were saying in your talk earlier about how much assistance is determined by the resources and capabilities of the organization rather than the need on the ground. Thank you for that. And thank you for your question, Patricia. The second question that came in was an anonymous question, which asked, how popular are programs of cash transfer to the most vulnerable? And would this not ensure that money gets to those who need it the most?
Cash transfer is, I think, one of the whole talk about resilience, and I also see there's a talk about a nexus of humanitarianism and development. There are many very positive things about this to say. I mean, of course, if people don't get to choose their own priorities, cash relief can be make a major change, because you can have prioritize what you need. Is it education? Is it groceries? Is it the dentist? You can stay where you like. You don't need to sit in a refugee camp 24/7 to be getting something. So that's wonderful. And it is something that has been argued for by people from within the humanitarian sector, by people like you and me, the academics. We would say, hey, take people's agency and their capabilities. That should be the starting point. They have to have it to save their own life. So that is really great. Where it feels difficult is when that discourse on resilience is now being adopted so eagerly by governments, by actors like the World Bank. And there you feel like, whoa, it's now adopted in ways that also make it liable for instrumentalization and politicization. And that is the doubleness of it. So the language comes from us. I mean, us, the critical folks looking at or from humanitarian action or affected communities. And then now they have become part of the high politics. And now we have to all look very critical at them as well, without forgetting how important they can be for people and how important it is. And also the same with the development humanitarian nexus. I've always been a great advocate, you might even say, for what I would call developmental relief. So you do your humanitarian action in lines with ideas and principles of development, more participatory, more long lasting, more based on local institutions. But the moment that the development humanitarian nexus means that development is conflated with the nexus of migration and security, because development can be more partisan, then all the more reason to critically follow what is going on. So it's all double-faced, unfortunately and fortunately. That makes it so interesting. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. I just want to add, sort of going back to the cash transfers question and how the resilience discourse has been instrumentalized by a lot of different actors that have slightly different agendas. I wanted to link that to something else you mentioned in your presentation about the role of digital technologies in these processes and the extent to which they are empowering and enabling or disempowering in terms of accountability. What are some of the digital technologies that you're flagging in your research at the moment that you'd like to look into in more detail and that you think should be a big question mark over?
Well, as I already mentioned, the use of algorithms, but I'm saying it with a bit of, I'm sort of the last person entitled to talk about it because I hardly know what an algorithm is. But I just hear resonate and I hear people say how they are being used and how powerful they have become. For example, in the this is a very nice example because there's now a change to forecast financing in disasters and in relation to climate change as well. And of course, it's a wonderful idea that rather than waiting for people to fail their harvest, people get some assistance, social protection assistance before even the bad weather sets in, and hence can protect their cattle, their crops, etc., because they get a cash transfer before the season. How much more beautiful can you get it if you think about prevention and stuff like that? However, what I also hear is that many people are totally puzzled by it because who is eligible and not depends on an algorithm. So one person gets a message, hey, you will get some money before the season starts, and the neighbor doesn't. And they don't know what is the difference between me and my neighbor. So again, this is a double-faced issue. And you're right, it is empowering. I mean, it is the kind of assistance we couldn't have dreamed a few years ago, that we would actually be capable of to forecast financing. We wouldn't have dreamt of the possibilities that it would be feasible that you have millions of migrants, refugees coming from Syria, and you can help all of them because you have the technology of a visa and can do cash transfer. It's wonderful. It's a miracle, but it's a miracle that has edges to it that we have to really, really look at. And then when I say accountability, then I mean really more, let's not forget that social engineering and social technologies are also political. So how you organize your participatory things, how agencies talk with people through focus group discussions, how accountability is organized, that is social technology, but it's just as political as the hardware.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've got a couple more questions in the Q&A function here. So one from Chiara, who says, thank you very much for your presentation. It's extremely interesting. I was wondering if accountability has not been really implemented in the past, despite advocacy being there. For example, Catherine Bolkovac, if I've pronounced that right, when she revealed the whole issue of sex trafficking in post-war Bosnia and the involvement of peacekeepers and protection agencies. Why then, why would it be taken seriously now if it hasn't been taken seriously before? What changed in the mentalities or governance for accountability to be actually implemented or taken seriously now?
Well, I guess this is a question whether is a glass half full, is it half empty? Do you try to maintain some I'm always a bit of on the side that like empirically there are many reasons to be pessimistic, but politically I think it is better to be a bit hopeful and to be a bit optimistic and to see efforts as they are. So in 2002 or 2004, I think the first big scandal around aid happened. And it did set lots of things into motions. It did set standards into motions. It is, there was already before the renewed scandal in 2017, there was a whole setup of investigation training. So people have been trained to investigate cases of sexual exploitation and abuse in the aid sector by dozens. I mean, real substantive numbers of people have already been trained to do it. There were the standards. There's the work of the Core Humanitarian Standard Alliance. There is just actually before the renewed scandal in 2017, what we saw happening was that at the time we had such huge crisis. I mean, there was Syria, there were many others, there was the big drought again. There was a real stretching of financial challenges. So just prior to 2017, some of the bigger donors withdrew their support for PSEAH. So IASC, I'm sorry, I'm talking jargon here. IASC, the International Agency Interagency Standing Committee, and the CHS Alliance, they just decided, no, we have to keep going to train folks, even with our own resources, because we cannot let go of this. So things had happened, they started to calm down, and now with renewed vigorism, they have come up. And I do see lots of things happening. Is it going to make a big fundamental change? We can go back to mindsets, we can think very structural, and then you can be slightly pessimistic, but things are happening. And one of the concerns I have, they might be happening too top down. And, oh, it's a crisis. Oh, I have a solution. Oh, I bring in a new institution. Bang, 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 with elephant feet, run through the field. Or do you actually build on what has been achieved in those 10 years prior to the second wave, so to speak? Do you actually build on the lessons that have been learned? Do you build on local institutions? Do you bring in your national feminist organizations and all those?
I really like that you opened out to answer that as well on a note of hope and optimism, which I think can be quite missing a lot in critical reflections on topics like accountability and advocacy. And I was listening to a podcast from the New Humanitarian a while ago on the prospect of multilateral reform, and some of the discussion was talking about how humanitarian actors and scholars can be some of the most self-flagellating in the international arena, constantly critiquing and self-reflecting. And I think that is necessary for change, as you pointed out, but it's important to be hopeful and optimistic. And I think, especially when thinking about students and humanitarian studies as an education program as well, I think students can sometimes feel a little bit pessimistic after critique, but there is hope that things are changing.
No, but the achievements are amazing. if you look at the numbers of people who died in disasters and how it has come down, even though the number of disasters increases, but the people who die from them have really gone down tremendously. And that has a lot to do with general developments, democracy perhaps, where it still exists, and economic development. But it also has to do with response capacities. What we see happening in Bangladesh, the number of lives saved there is tremendous. So the life-saving capacity of the humanitarian sector is beyond anything else. And the amount of changes, the level of changes that we've seen, and the learnings, and within something happens in the world, within 24 hours, everybody's ready to respond. Planes are on their way, needs assessments are being done. And of course, the whole system becomes very quickly politicized after that. But let's not forget these achievements. And I was just, if I can give a tiny example from the Netherlands, I mean, we are having a COVID crisis here, like you and everywhere else. And our government has made such a mess out of it that they forgot to ask anybody who they just ordered, like the caps, the this, the that, and the other. They just ordered. Nobody bothered to ask for invoices. Nobody bothered to keep check of what was. Now they lost, not lost, but they don't know what they did with, I think, 6 billion euro that they spent on COVID-related measures, and nobody kept track of where it went to. The international humanitarians, wherever they go and how big the mess is, they always have their act in order. And they know how to go about this. They know how to combat corruption and stuff like that. So I'm very impressed by the humanitarian sector.
Great. So we've got 7 minutes left approximately, and a number of questions and a comment as well from Rosanna Hamaz in the chat. So I'll just quickly go to the next question, and maybe we'll do shorter answers and see if we can get through them all before the end. So Louisa has asked, thank you for your talk. Do you see the humanitarian sector growing bigger and bigger, despite the fact that humanitarian interventions are supposed to be a short-term temporary fix? Or do you think it will blend with the development sectors, given the overlap of actors, strategies, concepts, and agendas? And that actually links to a question asked by Shams earlier about the humanitarian development nexus, which I ticked as answered, as you mentioned a bit. You expanded a bit on that anyway.
I think the distinction between humanitarian actors and development actors is also blurring increasingly. I mean, we all know there's many multi-mandate organizations, and increasingly it is not so much anymore what organization you are, but in what context you work. And the working modalities are slightly different, and I hope we will be more conscious of it. Working modalities are and should be different in high intensity conflict, as they should be different in authoritarian areas with authoritarian states, as they should be different in more fragile post-conflicty type of situations, no matter whether you're humanitarian or development.
Okay, perfect. A nice, concise answer. Excellent.
I'm trying.
Over to Poonam's question. Thank you again for your excellent presentation. You've raised some really important points. One of the things you mentioned was related to supply and demand, increasing demand for humanitarian response and limited capacity of concerned stakeholders. How do we meet this gap? Would it be more effective if we were to argue against the approach to the current focus on extra/super vulnerable?
Sorry, I didn't quite get it. Did she say that it's actually smart to do that, and that we should? I didn't get it.
So she's picking up on.
Can you go up in the chat so I can read it as well?
Yeah, it's in the Q&A box.
In the Q&A. Oh, we also have a Q&A box.
Okay. That's where the main questions have been coming in.
Sorry.
Poonam's question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how do we meet the gap? Yeah. Well, I really think we have to be critical there, and I see you are. But I'm also, how can I say this? To be honest, when I'm in Lesbos, for example, and I'm talking to the humanitarians, I see the anger that the definitions have become so restricted. But in some way, I can also empathize with the difficulties of humanitarians, because they just don't get a space to ship everybody to the mainland and have everybody brought to asylum procedures. So they're being placed into a little corner, and they know we can only ship so many. So how are we selecting other than trying to have the best criteria to select the most pitiful, the most dreadful cases? And then we can talk with the humanitarians like, are there not really biases in the way you do this? For example, again, those boys that have to prostitute in the parks. But so what are the biases in that selection? And secondly, of course, advocacy with the political actors, like be more generous, get more folks to the mainland to be processed in other countries in Europe. We agreed when the Turkey deal was made, all countries in Europe agreed to bring a certain number of people from Greece to their own country, and they haven't done it. The Netherlands haven't done it. Maybe the UK has done it, but I don't think it has. No, I think Germany might have done it.
Thank you. And so a final question from Sangeeta and then a comment from Rosanna I'll go over to. So Sangeeta said, thank you very much for your presentation. You used the term humanitarian care as opposed to the conventional humanitarian aid, assistance or relief. Could you elaborate a bit more on this concept of humanitarian care and how it might differ from other conventional framings? Why might it be important to talk about care?
That is a very intriguing question. I think I did it totally without thinking. So that must be the influence of people who talk about care around me. They're, like the feminist notions of care, but also the solidarians in Greece. I think there's a strong feeling. I mean, there's nothing wrong with humanitarian assistance. The way it was set up, the principle of humanity is a very strong principle that you feel like you're part of humanity and you have an impulse that wherever life-threatening suffering is being felt, you step in and you do it. And I think when people now talk about feminist notions of care, to some extent, there's nothing feminist about it. It's put on the agenda by feminists. If the solidarians talk about solidarity, what they really, but not what they really mean. It's not for me to say what they really mean, but how I really hear it is partly that humanitarianism should go back to its principled commitment to care for people who are suffering. And unfortunately, today in the humanitarian sector, where aid means who is eligible to aid, bringing the algorithm, etc., is just alienating from this idea of humanity. So care is bringing something back of, hey, folks, remember what we were here for. We were here to care. And I think that is what it means. But I find it actually interesting to see that somebody picks up that I started to use the term. I wasn't so aware of that. Yeah.
One of my questions that I thought to ask actually was going to be about thinking of our new undergraduate student cohort that's coming in. What kind of key topics would you recommend for research, given that they might not be at that stage of doing participatory and collaborative research just yet? Maybe humanitarian care is one of those. So, oh, sorry, we're just in the last minute now, if that's all right. So I'd just like to read Rosanna's comment out. We have had another question underneath from Helio, so maybe we could do a text answer to that at some point in the break. Sorry, we won't get the chance to go to it. But Rosanna said that Thea highlighted some of the issues faced by adolescents and that they're a marginalized group often overlooked. The danger also is that shocks during adolescence can have lasting impacts on their own outcomes, as well as that of their offspring. For example, significant shocks to nutrition faced by girls during 13 to 15 years can have significant negative impacts on the health of offspring they may go on to have when they reach their 20s. I don't know if you want to respond to that comment.
No, I'm totally agreeing with it. And maybe it just helps to, I don't know if this is also a commentary. I know I often talk about boys, and that is because I think they are invisibilized within the humanitarian sector, but not because I think the suffering of girls is not, it's not of course a bias or a preference. And so I totally agree with this, and it's for adolescents in general. I mean, it's a very important, and it's very shameful that humanitarians often, and I think it has to do with the godliness of children. So people who donate, people who are the constituency, they love to think that they give money for small children because they're innocent and it's youth and it's the future. So many programs have a real cut-off point at, for example, 6 or 7 years without any reason other than the donations came for that age group. And there's no other reason for that. And adolescents are already now, unfortunately, boys in particular, but also girls in that age group where people feel, oh, they are a group of concern, not so much a group of care, but a group of concern. What will they do when they go bigger? Will they become terrorists? Will they migrate to Europe? What will they do? And well, that could be a motivation to help them. Then you could say, well, never mind the ideas behind it as long as the care comes forward. But it could also be, I don't know, creating very strange programs where you spend more money in the border protection than in actually helping young people to advance their life chances. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you so much for such a fantastic keynote there and an engaged response to the questions. And thank you everyone in the audience as well for engaging via the chat and the Q&A function. Helio, we'll get to your question in a text response in the break. But for now, I'd love to say, please join me in saying thank you to Thea for the keynote. It was very good, very enjoyable.
Thank you. Yeah.
And we shall move on at 11:30 to the panel discussion where we'll pick up on some of these threads. Please do take a 10-minute break from your screen, go grab a glass of water and have a stretch. And we will see you back